The heavy, humid air of a June night clung to me as I stepped out of the house. It was just after 1:00 a.m., and the celebratory noise of the party behind me was finally beginning to fade into a dull hum. My name is Elena *, and that night I made a choice that would tether my soul to a stretch of lonely asphalt for the rest of my life. I had 3 large margaritas in my system, enough to make the world feel a little soft at the edges, enough to make my judgment dangerously fluid. I knew I shouldn't be driving, but my apartment was only 20 minutes away, and the thought of sleeping in my own bed was more persuasive than the voice of caution. To avoid the possibility of a police sobriety checkpoint or the judgment of other drivers, I decided to take the back roads. These were narrow, winding veins of pavement that cut through the dense, unlit woods on the outskirts of town. I rolled down the windows of my old sedan, letting the rushing night air whip through the cabin. I hoped the chill would sharpen my senses and burn off the haze of the alcohol. The road was a ribbon of blackness, illuminated only by my flickering headlights. On either side, the trees stood like ancient, silent sentinels, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel of leaves. For miles, there was nothing. No houses, no streetlights, and not a single pair of approaching headlights. Then I saw the light. Up ahead, a lone, rusted street lamp was struggling to stay lit, buzzing and flickering rhythmically against the darkness. Standing directly beneath that stuttering glow were 2 figures. I slammed on the brakes, the tires letting out a muffled protest against the grit of the road. My heart hammered against my ribs as the car slowed to a halt. There, in the middle of nowhere at 1 a.m, stood 2 children, a boy, perhaps 11 years old, and a girl, no older than 10. They weren't crying. They weren't waving for help. They were just standing. They remained perfectly still, their shadows dancing erratically on the pavement as the street lamp overhead pulsed with a sickly yellow light. I should have kept driving. Every instinct in my body told me that this was wrong, that children don't just wait on forest roads in the middle of the night. But the alcohol had softened my fear into a misplaced sense of duty. I leaned over and rolled the passenger window down further. The girl stepped toward the car. "Can you take us home?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the high-pitched panic you would expect from a lost child. It sounded cold, like wind moving through an empty hallway. "Where are your parents? What are you doing out here?" I asked, my voice trembling. I looked around, but the woods remained silent and empty. There were no stalled cars, no nearby houses, nothing but the looming trees. "We're lost," the boy said, stepping into the light. "We just need to go home." "I can call the police," I said, reaching for my phone on the center console. I checked the screen. There wasn't a single bar of service. The no service icon seemed to mock me. "No police," the girl whispered. "Just take us home, we'll tell you where to turn." Before I could agree or protest, they moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. They opened the rear door, climbed into the back seat, and buckled their seatbelts without being asked. I watched them in the rearview mirror. Their clothes were bizarre, not dirty or torn, but hopelessly outdated. The boy wore khakis and a striped polo shirt that looked like it had been plucked from a 1990s department store catalog. The girl wore a denim jumper with small embroidered flowers. I put the car in gear and started driving. For the first few miles, the silence was suffocating. Then the boy leaned forward, his face inches from the back of my seat. "Are you tired, Elena?" he asked. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told them my name. "How do you know who I am?" The girl reached out and pulled the boy back into his seat. "Not yet, Jacob," she hissed. "It's not time to talk about that yet." "Talk about what?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "The speed," the boy said, ignoring my question. "You're driving much slower than you did back then. You're being so careful now." The alcohol was gone, replaced by a sharp, piercing dread. The road ahead seemed to stretch and warp. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. I realized I didn't recognize this part of the woods anymore. The pavement was cracked, overgrown with weeds, and the air inside the car had become unnaturally cold. "Turn left at the next crossing," the girl commanded. I followed her directions, turning onto a dirt path that led deeper into the heart of the forest. The headlights caught a flash of rusted iron. It was a gate. Behind it, rows of weathered, leaning headstones stood in the tall grass. A cemetery. "This isn't a neighborhood," I whispered, my voice choking. "Why are we at a graveyard?" "This is where the ride ended," Jacob said. He pointed to a spot near the edge of the road just outside the gate. "This is where you left us." Suddenly, a memory I had spent 10 years trying to drown in a bottle came rushing back with the force of a physical blow. A flash of white light, the sound of a sickening thud, the sight of two small figures spinning through the air in my rearview mirror as I floored the accelerator, too terrified to stop, too selfish to care. I looked in the mirror again, but the back seat was empty. The seatbelts were still buckled, but the children were gone. I sat there in the dark, the engine idling as the realization crashed over me. I hadn't picked up two children. I had picked up a debt. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaking. There on the inside of the rear window were two sets of small, muddy handprints. The mud was fresh, smelling of wet earth and old stone. I looked toward the gate, and in the distance, under the faint glow of the moon, I saw them. They were standing by a small, twin headstone, watching me. They weren't waiting for a ride anymore. They were waiting for me to join them. The heavy iron door of the county jail cell slammed shut with a finality that made my teeth ache. I was no longer Elena, the woman who had spent 10 years trying to outrun a shadow. I was inmate 402, the woman who had finally stopped and let the shadow catch her. After I walked into the precinct and confessed to the hit and run of *Kemma and Jacob Martinez ***, the police treated me with a mixture of confusion and cold efficiency. Detective Miller had spent hours questioning me. He pushed grainy, yellowed crime scene photos across the table, images of the very road I had driven on, the same flickering street lamp, and the two small, broken bodies found in the weeds a decade ago. "We never found the car, Elena," Miller had said, his voice a low, tired rasp. "No witnesses, no paint transfers, just two kids left on the shoulder at 1:00 a.m. Why now? Why today?" "Because they came back for their ride," I whispered. I told him about the muddy handprints on the asterisk inside asterisk of my car window. Forensics had confirmed the impossible. The mud was a perfect chemical match for the soil in the Martinez family plot at the local cemetery. I was moved to a holding cell to await my arraignment. The air in the jail was stagnant, smelling of industrial bleach and old sweat. I sat on the thin, plastic-covered mattress, staring at the gray cinder-block walls. I thought that by confessing, the heavy weight on my chest would lift. But the silence of the cell was even more terrifying than the forest. Around 1:00 a.m., the anniversary hour, the fluorescent light in the hallway began to hum and flicker. A sudden, piercing chill swept through the room, turning my breath into thick white plumes of mist. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was coming from directly beneath my bunk. It was the unmistakable sound of small, sharp fingernails dragging against concrete. I pulled my knees to my chest, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack a rib. "Elena." The voice didn't come from the hallway. It came from the shadows in the corner of my cell. A small figure stepped into the sliver of moonlight. It was Emma. She was still wearing the floral denim jumper, but it was no longer clean. It was torn, soaked with the dark, dried-on stains of a decade-old tragedy. Her skin looked like gray parchment, and her eyes were two bottomless pits of sorrow. "You're not supposed to be here," I gasped, my teeth chattering. "I gave them my name. I'm going to prison. Isn't that enough?" Emma tilted her head with a sickening, skeletal crack. "Prison is just another cage, Elena. We don't want you in a cage. We want to go home. But the gate is locked from the other side." "I can't open it," I cried out. No, a second voice joined in. Jacob stepped out from behind the heavy steel door which remained shut and locked. But the passenger can. The one who told you to keep driving. The one who watched us die in the rearview mirror. My breath hitched. For 10 years I had suppressed the truth even from myself. I hadn't been alone that night. My boyfriend at the time, *Liam*, had been in the passenger seat. When I had screamed and tried to hit the brakes, he had grabbed my arm. He had hissed into my ear, "If you stop, your life is over. They're already dead. Drive, Elena, drive." He was the one who convinced me to burn my bloody clothes. He was the one who sold the car in another state. He had moved on to become a successful architect, living in a glass-walled mansion on the hill, while I lived in a bottle of tequila. "He's the one who stayed warm while we stayed cold," Jacob said, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. Suddenly, the cell door didn't just open, it dissolved. The hallway outside was gone, replaced by the dark, misty road through the woods. The twins reached out their hands. Their fingers were gray and rimmed with graveyard dirt. "Take us to him, Elena," they said in unison. "Take us to the passenger. It's time for the final stop." I felt an invisible force pull me off the bed. My feet didn't seem to touch the ground as I followed the two small shadows out into the night. We weren't going back to the police station. We were going to the one place where the truth was still hidden behind expensive glass and lies. The transition from the cramped, concrete walls of the jail cell to the expansive, cold night air was seamless and terrifying. I wasn't walking. I was being pulled by an invisible tether, my feet barely skimming the gravel as I followed the two small, monochromatic figures of Emma and Jacob. We arrived at a massive, modern estate perched on a hill, a house of glass and expensive black steel that overlooked the city like a predator. This was Liam's fortress, built on a foundation of lies and the blood of two children. The front gates, heavy and reinforced, swung open without a sound. As we moved up the winding driveway, the air around us began to vibrate with that same rhythmic, wet static I had heard on the radio 10 years ago. It was the sound of a heart stopping, 2 hearts to be exact. We reached the front door. It didn't just unlock, it shattered inward, the glass turning into fine dust before it could hit the floor. We stepped into the grand foyer. The interior was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, but as the twins entered, the white marble floors began to turn gray, and the expensive scent of vanilla was replaced by the overwhelming stench of wet cemetery earth. Liam appeared at the top of the floating glass staircase, clutching a silk robe around his waist. He looked older, more tired, but the moment his eyes landed on me, he turned ashen. He didn't see the twins yet. They were still shadows clinging to my heels, but he felt the temperature drop to sub-zero. "Elena, how did you get in here? I heard you were in custody. I told you to stay away from me." Liam's voice was a frantic, high-pitched screech. "I tried to stay away, Liam," I said, my breath hitching in the freezing air. "But the passengers you left behind. They're tired of waiting in the dark. They want to finish the ride." I stepped aside and the shadows behind me expanded, stretching up the walls until they reached the ceiling. From the darkness, Emma and Jacob emerged. They didn't look like children anymore. They looked like vengeful monuments of the accident. Their skin was translucent, showing the jagged breaks in their bones, and their eyes were filled with the black ink of the void. You're dead," Liam stammered, his glass of scotch falling from his hand and exploding on the marble below. "It was an accident, it was dark. We didn't see you until it was too late." "You saw us in the mirror," Jacob's voice boomed, vibrating through the glass walls of the house until they began to spiderweb with cracks. "You saw us crawling in the dirt, reaching for help, and you told her to floor it. You killed us twice, once with the car and once with your silence." Emma glided up the stairs, her feet not touching the steps. Liam tried to run, but he was frozen, his boots fused to the glass landing. She reached out a small, gray hand and touched his chest. Where her fingers landed, the silk burned away, leaving 5 black, scorched marks that smelled of ozone and ancient soil. "One stays," Emma whispered, her voice echoing in Liam's head. "One must stay behind to watch the road forever. The other comes with us." "No, please, I'll give you anything. I'll give you the money, the house." Liam begged, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. "We don't want your house, Liam," Jacob said, appearing behind him. "We want the 10 years you stole. We want the air you breathed while we were choked with dirt." The house began to shake violently. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows began to implode one by one, the shards of glass suspended in midair by a supernatural force. A swirling vortex of shadow and white light erupted in the center of the foyer. I watched, paralyzed, as the twins gripped Liam's arms. Their small hands looked like iron shackles against his skin. "The ride is over, Liam," they said together. In a blinding flash of light that smelled of rain and iron, they were gone. The twins, the shadows, and Liam all vanished in a heartbeat. The house fell into a tomb-like silence. The glass shards that had been hovering in the air crashed to the floor all at once, sounding like 1,000 breaking mirrors. When the police arrived, triggered by the home's security system, they found me standing alone in the wreckage. There was no sign of Liam. His silk robe was lying on the floor, perfectly intact but empty. On the inside of the front window, high up where no human could reach, were 2 small, muddy handprints. I was taken back to jail, and eventually I was sentenced for my part in the crime. But the detectives could never explain what happened to Liam. He was declared a missing person, a billionaire who simply evaporated into thin air. I sit in my cell now, watching the moon through the bars. People ask me if I'm scared to be alone. I tell them I'm never alone. At exactly 1:00 a.m. every night, the light in the hallway flickers. I don't look at the shadows anymore. I just listen to the sound of a car engine idling in the distance and the soft, rhythmic tapping of small fingernails against the glass. The debt is paid, but the road never forgets.